The morning we approached the German line, the silence hit us first. Not the usual quiet between artillery barrages, but something deeper, like the forest itself had stopped breathing. I led my squad through the fog-shrouded trees of Belleau Wood, our boots sinking into earth that should have been churned by shell fire, but felt undisturbed, almost sacred in its stillness. The trenches appeared through the mist like scars in the landscape, perfectly preserved defensive positions that intelligence had marked as heavily contested just 72 hours prior. "Sarge, where are all the flies?" Hayes whispered behind me, his southern drawl barely audible above our careful footsteps through the undergrowth. He was right. No buzzing insects, no smell of decomposition that should have hung heavy in the air after a regiment's worth of men had supposedly died here. The absence felt wrong, like walking into a theater after the audience had vanished mid-performance, leaving only empty seats and the echo of interrupted applause. My old shrapnel wound from Chateau Thierry began its familiar ache, the fragments shifting under my skin as they always did when weather turned cold or danger pressed close. Rodriguez crossed himself silently, lips moving in Spanish prayers I'd learned to recognize over our months together, while Chen studied the German wire obstacles with the methodical attention he'd once given to engineering problems back in California. Kowalski brought up the rear, Chicago broad shoulders carrying his pack with the easy stride of a man who'd walked these kinds of patrols before, though his usual sardonic commentary remained uncharacteristically absent. The trenches stretched before us in textbook defensive formation, machine gun nests positioned for interlocking fields of fire, communication trenches zigzagging toward what should have been command bunkers, everything exactly as our intelligence maps had indicated. But no bodies, no equipment scattered by retreating forces, no signs of the fierce resistance that had supposedly taken place here just days ago. The wooden duckboards beneath our feet were clean, free of the mud and blood that marked every contested position we'd seen since crossing into France. "Doesn't add up," Chen muttered, kneeling beside a German machine gun position that had been abandoned with ammunition still belted and ready. The weapon sat on its mount like a predator frozen mid-hunt, barrel pointed toward approaches that should have been swept by devastating fire. Yet our advancing infantry had reported walking through these positions without encountering a single shot, finding trenches as empty as if they'd never been occupied at all. In the silence that followed Chen's observation, I heard it, faint and distant, carried on air so still it seemed to amplify every whisper. 3 notes pitched low and haunting, like someone whistling a melody from very far away. The sound came and went so quickly I might have imagined it, but something in Rodriguez's sudden stillness told me he'd heard it too. The whistle hung in my memory long after the forest returned to its unnatural quiet, a tune that felt familiar though I knew I'd never heard it before. "Form up," I ordered, checking my rifle's action with movements made automatic by months of combat. "We sweep these positions, then report back to battalion. Stay alert. Empty doesn't mean safe." But as we moved deeper into the German defensive network, the weight of absence pressed against us like fog, and that distant whistling seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. We found the first arrangement in what should have been a machine gun position commanding the northern approach. 15 German Stahlhelms arranged in a perfect circle, each helmet facing inward toward the center where a machine gun should have been mounted. Instead, the heavy weapon lay disassembled on the ground, its parts spread in smaller circles within the larger one, barrel separated from receiver, ammunition belts coiled like sleeping snakes between the steel domes. "Well, I'll be damned," Hayes breathed, his nervous energy making him shift from foot to foot despite the ankle he'd twisted crossing the German wire obstacles. "What kind of military formation is that supposed to be?" Chen crouched beside the arrangement, pulling out his field notebook to sketch the pattern with the precision that had made him valuable for reconnaissance work. His pencil moved across the paper in careful strokes, recording angles and distances with the methodical attention he'd once given to surveying railroad routes through the Sierra Nevada mountains. "Doesn't match any tactical doctrine I know," he said, voice carrying that flat California accent that marked him as different from the rest of us East Coast Marines. "Distance between each helmet is exactly 18 inches. Mathematical precision." Rodriguez stood at the circle's edge, unwilling to step across the invisible boundary the helmets seemed to create. "Dios mío," he whispered, the Spanish prayer carrying more weight than usual. "This isn't how soldiers leave their gear." His dark eyes tracked from helmet to helmet, noting details the rest of us had missed. How each one sat perfectly level despite the uneven ground. How the chin straps had been arranged in identical patterns. How the morning light reflected off the steel in ways that seemed to pulse with some internal rhythm. Kowalski picked up one of the helmets, turning it over in his hands with the casual disrespect he'd shown German equipment since we'd landed in France. "This ain't right," he muttered, Chicago accent thick with the kind of unease he usually masked behind dark humor. "Germans don't play games with their kit. They're practical bastards. Leave their gear where it's useful, not arranged like some church altar." But it was the machine gun's disassembly that troubled me most. The weapon hadn't been hastily abandoned or destroyed to prevent capture. Each component had been carefully separated and placed within the helmet circle with the same mathematical precision Chen had noted. The barrel pointing true north, the receiver aligned east-west, ammunition belts forming smaller spirals that seemed to mirror the larger pattern. This was deliberate, purposeful, but following a logic I couldn't understand. As we studied the arrangement, that faint whistling returned, clearer now and seeming to come from the center of the helmet circle itself. 3 notes in descending pitch, repeated twice, then silence so complete it made my ears ring. Rodriguez crossed himself again, and I noticed Hayes had stopped his nervous shuffling to listen, head cocked like a dog hearing sounds beyond human perception. "Mark this position," I ordered, though my voice carried less certainty than I'd intended. "We'll report it to intelligence when we get back." But even as I said the words, I knew no intelligence manual contained protocols for reporting ritual arrangements of enemy equipment. The helmets stared up at us with empty eye slits, and in the growing morning light I could swear the metal surfaces reflected images that weren't quite right. Shadows where no shadows should fall, movements where nothing moved. The whistling came once more as we prepared to leave the position. 3 notes that seemed to follow us as we moved deeper into the German defensive network. Hayes's ankle caused him to stumble, and for a moment he reached out to steady himself against one of the helmets. His hand stopped inches from the steel surface, trembling with effort as if some invisible force held it back. "Can't touch it," he whispered, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not fear exactly, but recognition, as if he'd encountered something similar in dreams he couldn't quite remember. "Something won't let me." We left the helmet circle undisturbed, but I could feel its presence behind us as we continued our patrol. A weight of attention that suggested we were being watched, measured, perhaps judged by standards no military manual had ever conceived. The German bunker entrance emerged from the earth like a mouth carved into the hillside, concrete reinforcement still bearing the geometric precision of enemy engineering. But the usual signs of military occupation were absent. No sandbags reinforcing the approaches, no communication wires leading to command positions, no defensive obstacles protecting what should have been a critical strongpoint in their defensive network. Instead, the opening gaped dark and inviting, as if whatever had built it wanted visitors. Rodriguez approached the entrance with his rifle ready, movements careful but confident. Of all of us, he'd shown the most aptitude for tunnel warfare, slipping through underground passages with the silent grace he'd learned hunting in the New Mexico mountains before the war. But as he neared the concrete threshold, he stopped abruptly, head tilted in the listening posture that had saved our lives in a dozen previous encounters. "Breathing," he said simply, the single word carrying enough weight to make the rest of us freeze in place. "Something's breathing down there, slow and deep, like it's sleeping." Hayes moved closer despite his injured ankle, Southern curiosity overcoming the caution that had kept him alive through 3 major offensives. "Don't hear nothing," he whispered, but his voice carried the uncertainty of a man trying to convince himself of something he knew wasn't true. The fog had begun to lift with the morning sun, but around the bunker entrance it seemed to thicken, rolling out of the dark opening like exhalations from some vast lung. Chen consulted his military maps, comparing the bunker's position to intelligence reports that showed this sector as lightly defended, more of a listening post than a major fortification. "Should connect to the communication trenches," he said, pencil tracing routes across the paper with mechanical precision. "Underground network probably extends 1/4 mile in each direction. Standard German construction for this sector." But as he spoke, I heard what Rodriguez had detected. Not quite breathing, but a rhythmic movement of air that suggested vast spaces beyond the concrete entrance, chambers and tunnels that seemed to pulse with their own atmosphere. The sound came in regular intervals, like someone or something drawing breath at the bottom of a deep well, each inhalation and exhalation carrying hints of sounds that didn't belong in any military installation. Kowalski tested his flashlight, the beam cutting through the fog-thick air to illuminate perhaps 20 feet of concrete corridor before disappearing into absolute darkness. "This ain't right," he repeated, the phrase becoming his personal mantra for encounters that defied military logic. "Germans don't abandon prepared positions. They fight for every inch of ground, make you pay in blood for every foot you advance." The breathing grew more noticeable as we stood at the threshold, and with it came that haunting whistle we'd heard at the helmet circle. But now, the 3-note pattern seemed to echo from deep within the tunnel system, bouncing off concrete walls and steel reinforcements to create harmonies that shouldn't have been possible from such a simple melody. The sound drew us forward despite every instinct that screamed warnings about advancing into unknown territory without proper reconnaissance. "We establish perimeter watch," I decided, military training overriding the growing unease that made my shrapnel wound ache with renewed intensity. Rodriguez takes point. Chen maps whatever we find. Rest of us maintain rear security. Standard tunnel protocol: stay together, watch for booby traps, maintain communication with surface. But even as I gave the orders, I knew this wouldn't be a standard operation. The breathing from below had changed rhythm, becoming deeper and more deliberate, as if whatever slept in those tunnels had become aware of our presence and was preparing to wake. The whistling grew louder, more complex, adding notes and harmonies that seemed to come from multiple sources scattered throughout the underground network. Rodriguez blessed himself once more before stepping across the threshold, and I noticed his usual confidence had been replaced by the careful movements of a man walking into a cathedral where he didn't belong. The fog followed us into the tunnel, carrying scents that had nothing to do with military installations. Earth and metal, yes, but underneath something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. As we descended into the German bunker system, the breathing became our metronome, setting the pace of our advance with inhalations and exhalations that seemed to draw us deeper into spaces that existed outside the war we thought we were fighting. The wooden markers began appearing 50 yards into the tunnel system, carved symbols that definitely weren't German military standard, but seemed to follow their own internal logic. Each piece of wood had been carefully shaped and positioned at regular intervals along the concrete walls, symbols burned into the surface with precision that suggested tools and time, patience and purpose. Rodriguez ran his fingers over the carvings, tracing patterns that seemed familiar, though none of us could say why. Trail markers, Chen observed, comparing the symbols to his growing collection of sketches and notes. Someone wanted people to follow this route. Question is who, and where do they lead? His engineering background made him appreciate the craftsmanship. Each marker placed at eye level, each symbol clearly visible even in the reduced light of our flashlights. Each position calculated to guide travelers deeper into the tunnel network. The symbols themselves defied easy interpretation. Some resembled military insignia, but with details wrong or missing, like someone had tried to recreate German unit markers from memory and failed. Others looked more primitive, carved patterns that might have predated the war entirely, ancient markings that seemed to pulse with their own significance in the dancing beam of our electric torches. Hayes ran his hands along the wall between markers, searching for additional carvings we might have missed. "Well, I'll be damned if these weren't here when the Germans built this place," he muttered, ankle still causing him to favor his left leg as we continued deeper into the system. Concretes poured around them, like they were here first and the builders just worked around them. But that don't make sense. This whole sector was empty farmland before the war. Kowalski studied one marker more closely, holding his flashlight beam steady while he examined the burned symbols. "This ain't right," he said for the third time that morning, but now his usual skepticism carried undertones of something approaching wonder. "Look at this one. It's a Chicago City seal, but wrong somehow. Like someone knew the basic design but changed all the details that mattered." The tunnel branched ahead of us, 3 passages leading in different directions, each marked with its own wooden symbol. The left passage bore a carving that resembled Rodriguez's family crest from New Mexico, while the right showed symbols that might have been Chen's railroad company logo rendered in primitive woodwork. The center passage displayed a marker that looked disturbingly like my own unit insignia from our previous deployment, though the details had been altered in ways that made it seem both familiar and threatening. "They know us," Rodriguez whispered, the observation carrying implications none of us wanted to consider. "Whoever carved these, they know who we are, where we come from. This center one? Sarge, that's your unit marker, isn't it? But wrong somehow, like looking at yourself in a cracked mirror." The breathing we'd heard from the surface had grown stronger as we followed the markers deeper, and now it seemed to come from all 3 passages simultaneously, creating acoustic effects that shouldn't have been possible in a concrete tunnel system. The air moved in rhythmic patterns, drawing us toward the center passage despite every military instinct that warned against following unknown routes without proper reconnaissance. That haunting whistle returned as we stood at the 3-way intersection, but now the melody came in harmony. 3 distinct voices singing the same tune from different passages, creating musical structures that seemed to reshape the tunnel acoustics around us. The sound was beautiful and terrible, familiar enough to make us want to follow it deeper, alien enough to trigger every survival instinct we developed through months of combat. "We vote," I decided, though command protocol suggested I should make this decision alone. Center passage follows the markers that seem to know us. Left and right might lead to defensive positions or supply areas, but something's drawing us toward the center, and we need to decide together whether we follow or establish fallback positions. The squad considered this in silence, broken only by the rhythmic breathing from all three passages and the complex harmony of whistling that seemed to evaluate our decision-making process. Hayes shifted nervously, testing his injured ankle against the concrete floor. Chen made additional notes, trying to map the tunnel junction with mathematical precision. Rodriguez prayed silently, lips moving in Spanish supplications that seemed more urgent than usual. "This ain't right, but it's what we came to investigate," Kowalski said finally. "If something took out a whole German regiment, we need to know what it was. Center passage it is." The wooden markers led us deeper into spaces that felt less like military installations and more like pathways through some underground forest where different rules applied and different things waited in the darkness ahead. The mass grave stretched across what should have been a communication trench. Skeletal remains arranged in defensive positions as if death had frozen them mid-battle. But these weren't combat casualties. The bones showed no signs of shellfire damage, no shrapnel scars or bullet holes, no evidence of the violent trauma that marked every battlefield we'd seen. Instead, the remains sat in perfect firing positions, rifles still shouldered, eye sockets staring down imaginary sights toward approaches that would never again witness enemy assault. "Jesus Christ Almighty," Hayes breathed, his southern accent thick with revulsion and growing panic. "How many you count, Sarge?" "Must be 50 men, maybe more, all sitting like they're still on watch duty." His injured ankle gave out completely, dropping him to his knees beside the trench edge where he could see the full scope of the arrangement. German uniforms hung in tatters from bleached bones, unit insignia still visible on collars and helmets, but the flesh had been removed so cleanly it might have been surgical. Chen approached the remains with scientific detachment, notebook ready to document what defied documentation. "Bone arrangement suggests they died in position," he observed, voice carefully neutral, though I could hear the strain underneath his California calm. "No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication they tried to flee or fight back. It's like they just stopped being alive while maintaining military bearing." Rodriguez refused to enter the trench, standing at the rim with his rifle ready and prayers flowing in rapid Spanish. "Dios mío, this is not how soldiers die," he whispered. "Men fight, they run, they call for help. They don't just sit in formation while something strips the meat from their bones. This is evil, Sarge. Old evil, older than the war." The German field equipment remained functional, machine guns still mounted and ready, ammunition boxes organized with typical efficiency, communication equipment positioned for optimal coverage of their defensive sector. Someone had maintained the weapons after the soldiers died, cleaning barrels and replacing worn parts with the mechanical precision that characterized German military doctrine. But the maintenance had been performed by hands that understood function without comprehending purpose. Kowalski climbed down into the trench despite my orders to maintain distance, Chicago's stubbornness overriding military caution. "This ain't right," he muttered, examining one of the skeletal figures more closely. "Look at this one." Still got his finger on the trigger, eyes aimed down the sight picture, but there's no way he could have maintained that position if he died natural. Something arranged them after death, posed them like mannequins in a store window. The smell hit us as the morning fog lifted. Not the expected odor of decomposition, but something cleaner and wrong, like antiseptic mixed with old flowers. The scent seemed to emanate from the bones themselves, as if whatever had cleaned them so thoroughly had left behind a preservative that kept them eternally ready for inspection. My shrapnel wound began bleeding again, the old fragments shifting under stress and new atmospheric pressure. Hayes couldn't handle the scene, backing away from the trench with increasing desperation until he reached the tree line where he collapsed against a damaged oak. "Can't look at them anymore," he said, voice breaking with the strain of maintaining composure in the face of something that challenged every assumption about death and warfare. "They're watching us, Sarge." "I know they're dead, but they're still watching us, still waiting for orders that ain't never coming." The whistling began as we studied the bone arrangement, that three-note pattern now coming from multiple sources scattered throughout the trench. But the melody had changed, becoming discordant and wrong, as if the original haunting beauty had been processed through something that understood music but not humanity. The sound seemed to emanate from the skeletal remains themselves, breath passing through bone passages that shouldn't have been capable of producing sound. "We need to get Hayes back to aid station," I decided, though military protocol demanded we complete our reconnaissance before evacuating casualties. "Rodriguez, you escort him back to the perimeter markers we passed. Chen, finish documenting this position. Kowalski, help me search for anything that might explain what happened here." But as we prepared to divide the squad, the whistling grew louder and more complex, harmonies building upon themselves until the air in the trench seemed to vibrate with musical structures that hurt to hear. The bone soldiers maintained their eternal watch, and in the growing daylight I could swear their empty sockets tracked our movements with attention that transcended death. Hayes's breakdown became complete, requiring Rodriguez to half carry him away from the trench while he sobbed and gibbered about voices calling his name from inside the skeletal formation. The sound of their departure left the rest of us alone with the bone soldiers and their impossible music, and I began to understand that our reconnaissance mission had become something far more dangerous than investigating German defensive positions. The German field radio occupied the center of what should have been a command bunker, surrounded by communication equipment that hummed with electrical activity despite having no visible power source. Banks of receivers and transmitters lined concrete walls, their dials glowing with soft phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with that omnipresent breathing we'd first heard at the tunnel entrance. Miles of wire ran from the radio equipment through specially drilled holes in the concrete, connecting to destinations unknown but clearly extensive. Chen approached the central radio with his engineer's appreciation for technical complexity, noting how German standard equipment had been modified with components that didn't appear in any manual he'd studied. "Frequency range has been expanded beyond military specifications," he observed, pointing to dials and switches that shouldn't have existed on battlefield communication gear. "Someone's been experimenting with reception capabilities, trying to pick up signals from somewhere else." The radio crackled to life as we entered the bunker, speakers producing static that resolved into voices speaking languages that might have been German, but with pronunciation that hurt to hear. Words formed and dissolved in the electrical noise. Conversations between speakers who seemed to be describing locations and events that didn't match any battlefield reports we'd received. Rodriguez blessed himself as we listened, recognizing something in the distorted voices that made him step back toward the bunker entrance. "Dios mío, they're calling for help," he whispered, Spanish accent thick with growing horror. The voices in the static, they're German soldiers calling for extraction, but they're describing places that don't exist. Underground cities, forests made of metal, skies that burn without fire. And something's answering them, Sarge. Something's answering in voices that aren't human. Kowalski examined the wire connections, following cables that led through the concrete walls toward unknown destinations. "This ain't right," he muttered, studying junction boxes and signal amplifiers that had been installed with professional skill, but according to no electrical standard he recognized. This setup's designed to broadcast as well as receive. They're not just listening to something, they're talking back to it. The static resolved into clearer signals as Chen adjusted the frequency controls, and we began hearing what sounded like normal military communications until we listened more carefully. German voices reporting positions that didn't exist on any map, requesting supplies for units that had been destroyed weeks ago, describing tactical situations that made no sense in the context of the Western Front. But underneath the familiar military chatter, other voices responded, suggestions and commands in tones that sounded almost human, but carried harmonic structures that made our teeth ache. Someone's been using this equipment to communicate with whatever took the German regiment, I realized, studying the communication logs that had been meticulously maintained in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. Early reports are standard military traffic, but later entries describe contact with advisors who provided new tactical guidance for underground operations. The whistling pattern we'd been hearing throughout our mission suddenly erupted from the radio speakers at full volume. 3 notes repeated in complex harmonies that suggested multiple sources broadcasting simultaneously. But now the melody was accompanied by other sounds. Footsteps in tunnels, mechanical breathing, voices calling names in languages that predated human speech. The radio had become a window into spaces that existed parallel to our own world but operated according to different physical laws. Rodriguez's hand began bleeding where he'd cut it on the radio wire during our initial investigation, but the wound seemed to pulse in rhythm with the radio signals, as if his injury had created some form of resonance with the communication system. "It's trying to get inside," he said, voice tight with pain and growing understanding. "The radio isn't just receiving signals, it's creating a connection, letting something through from wherever those voices originate." Chen worked frantically to trace the wire connections, following cables that led deeper into the tunnel system we'd been exploring. "The whole network's been rewired," he reported, consulting his sketches and notes while electrical feedback from the radio made documentation increasingly difficult. "Every position we've investigated is connected to this central communication hub. Someone's been using German military infrastructure to build something that has nothing to do with fighting the war." The radio static began forming words in English, voices with American accents reporting from positions that sounded familiar, until we realized they were describing our own movements through the German defensive network. Someone, or something, had been monitoring our investigation, listening to our conversations, learning our names and our fears through communication equipment that shouldn't have been capable of such precision. As we prepared to leave the bunker, the radio broadcast that haunting whistle one final time, but now the melody seemed to follow us through the speakers, echoing from the wire network that connected every position in the German defensive system. We were no longer investigating abandoned fortifications. We were moving through a vast electronic nervous system that had been watching us since the moment we entered its territory. We woke to find our equipment had been rearranged during the night, personal items repositioned with the same mathematical precision we'd observed in the helmet circle and bone trench. Kowalski's Chicago White Sox Lucky Charm sat perfectly centered between his ammunition clips, while Chen's railroad pocket watch had been disassembled and reassembled in a configuration that somehow improved its accuracy. Rodriguez discovered his rosary beads arranged in spiral patterns around his sleeping area, each bead positioned to catch the morning light in ways that created shadow, patterns resembling religious iconography. "This ain't right," Kowalski muttered, studying the arrangement of his gear with growing unease. "Someone went through our stuff while we were sleeping, but nobody heard anything. And look at this, they didn't just move things around, they improved them. My gear's organized better than I could do it myself. Like whoever did this understood my personal systems better than I do." Hayes remained at the aid station marker where Rodriguez had left him, but his condition had deteriorated overnight. The Southern Marine sat motionless beside the medical supply cache, staring into the forest with eyes that tracked movements none of us could see. When Rodriguez tried to communicate with him, Hayes responded in German, speaking fluently despite having never learned the language, describing tactical situations and requesting support for operations that existed only in his altered perceptions. "Well, I'll be damned if he ain't talking to someone," Hayes had said before his breakdown became complete, but now his conversations continued in languages that shifted between German, French, and something older that hurt to hear. Rodriguez reported that Hayes claimed to see German soldiers moving through the tree line, maintaining defensive positions and following orders from commanders who issued instructions in that haunting 3-note whistle pattern. Chen documented the gear rearrangements with scientific precision, noting how the unknown manipulator had displayed intimate knowledge of each squad member's personal habits and equipment preferences. "Whoever did this has been observing us long enough to understand our individual organizational systems," he observed, sketching the precise placement of items in patterns that seemed random until viewed from specific angles. But the improvements suggest intelligence that goes beyond mere surveillance. This represents analysis and optimization. My ammunition count didn't match my memory, though I couldn't determine whether magazines had been added or removed. The numbers seemed right, but the arrangement felt wrong, as if someone had handled each cartridge and returned it to a position that appeared identical, but carried subtle differences I couldn't identify. My shrapnel wound throbbed with renewed intensity, the old fragments shifting under my skin in response to atmospheric changes that had nothing to do with weather patterns. Rodriguez blessed the rearranged equipment before touching any of it, Spanish prayers flowing in rapid succession as he tried to determine whether the mysterious manipulation represented benevolent attention or something more sinister. "Dios mío, they know everything about us," he whispered, examining his personal items with the careful attention of a man handling potential explosives. Our habits, our fears, our weaknesses. Whatever's been watching us has learned how we think, how we fight, how we might be defeated. The key, sense of observation intensified throughout the day, invisible attention that made the back of my neck prickle with awareness of scrutiny from unseen sources. Every movement felt choreographed, as if we were performing in some vast theater where the audience remained hidden but acutely interested in our every gesture and decision. The forest around us seemed to pulse with concealed watchers, and several times I caught glimpses of movement that disappeared when I turned to look directly. During our midday meal, the whistling pattern returned with new complexity, harmonies building from multiple sources scattered throughout the forest around our position. But now, the melody seemed to comment on our actions, musical phrases that responded to our conversations and movements with the timing of someone providing soundtrack to our activities. The sound had become interactive, engaging with us as participants rather than merely observing our passage through its territory. "It's learning from us," Chen realized, studying the acoustic patterns with his engineer's appreciation for systematic behavior. Each time we hear the whistling, it's become more complex, more responsive to our presence. Whatever's producing these sounds is using our reactions to refine its approach, developing better methods of communication or manipulation. The equipment rearrangements continued throughout our investigation, personal items shifting position whenever we left them unattended, always returning to configurations that demonstrated intimate knowledge of our individual psychology and tactical preferences. We were no longer conducting reconnaissance. We had become the subjects of some vast experiment conducted by intelligence that understood human behavior better than we understood ourselves. As evening approached, the watchers grew bolder, movement in the peripheral vision becoming more frequent and substantial. Something wanted us to know we were being observed, studied, perhaps prepared for purposes that remained hidden, but felt increasingly inevitable with each passing hour of our mission. The German command post had been carved into a natural cave system, concrete reinforcement blending with limestone formations to create spaces that felt both military and primordial. Hand-drawn maps covered every available wall surface, tunnel networks sketched in obsessive detail that went far beyond standard military cartography. But these weren't defensive positions. The maps showed spaces that extended for miles underground, chambers and passages that formed geometric patterns too complex and purposeful to be natural cave systems. Chen studied the cartography with professional fascination, comparing the hand-drawn networks to our official intelligence maps that showed only surface positions and known bunker locations. "These underground areas don't appear on any survey," he observed, tracing tunnel routes with his finger while consulting his own growing collection of sketches and measurements. "If these maps are accurate, there's an entire subterranean city beneath this sector, connecting German positions across a front that spans dozens of miles." The maps had been drawn in multiple hands, different writing styles, and drawing techniques suggesting collaborative effort over extended periods. Early sketches showed simple tunnel connections between existing bunkers, but later editions revealed increasingly complex architectural plans for underground chambers, ceremonial spaces, and connection points to natural cave systems that predated human occupation. Someone had been using German military positions as entry points to much older and more extensive underground networks. Rodriguez examined religious symbols scattered throughout the cartographic displays, markings that resembled Catholic iconography, but with details that made his prayers come faster and more urgently. "Dios mío, these aren't military maps," he whispered, pointing to areas marked with symbols that looked like altars, processional routes, and gathering spaces designed for purposes that had nothing to do with warfare. "Someone's been using German bunkers to access sacred spaces, places that should have remained hidden." Hayes had refused to enter the command post, claiming he could hear voices coming from deeper in the cave system, German soldiers calling for reinforcement and reporting contact with advisors who provided tactical guidance in exchange for access to surface military positions. His nervous breakdown accelerated whenever we approached areas marked on the maps as connection points between military and natural tunnel systems, Southern accent becoming unintelligible as he switched between English and languages none of us recognized. "Well, I'll be damned if I'm going down there," Hayes had declared, ankle injury providing convenient excuse for avoiding underground exploration that clearly terrified him on levels deeper than physical pain. "Y'all can investigate those tunnels if you want, but something's wrong with this whole sector. Wrong in ways that ain't natural, ain't military, ain't anything Christian soldiers should be messing with." Kowalski traced the most detailed map with growing unease, Chicago skepticism battling against evidence that suggested German military engineering had been co-opted for purposes that defied rational explanation. "This ain't right," he muttered, studying architectural drawings that showed underground chambers large enough to house hundreds of people, connected by tunnel networks that formed patterns recognizable from religious art and occult symbolism. Germans are practical. They build what they need, nothing fancy, nothing decorative. But these spaces are designed for ceremony, for ritual, for purposes that have nothing to do with fighting Americans. The maps showed connection points to our current position, routes that led directly to the tunnel system we'd been investigating. But they also revealed that our squad had been following a carefully planned path, our exploration guided by markers and arrangements that corresponded to specific routes marked on the German cartography. We hadn't been conducting independent reconnaissance. We'd been following a predetermined trail that led to destinations marked with symbols that made Rodriguez cross himself repeatedly. My shrapnel wound bled freely now, old fragments working their way toward the surface under stress and atmospheric pressure that seemed to intensify the deeper we moved into the cave system. The maps showed medical stations positioned at regular intervals along the tunnel routes, suggesting whoever had drawn them understood that passage through these underground spaces would require treatment for injuries that had nothing to do with enemy action. "We need to make a decision," I announced, though military hierarchy felt increasingly meaningless in spaces that operated according to non-military logic. Hayes stays here with communication equipment, maintains surface contact. Rest of us follow these maps to determine what the Germans were really doing in this sector. But this isn't reconnaissance anymore. This is something else. Something that's been planned since before we arrived. The whistling pattern filled the command post as we studied the maps. 3-note melody, now accompanied by harmonies that seemed to emanate from the tunnel entrances marked on the German cartography. The sound had become a form of navigation aid, growing stronger when we looked at routes that led deeper underground, softer when we considered areas marked as dangerous or forbidden, even by the mapmakers who had documented this hidden world. As we prepared for underground exploration, the maps seemed to shift in the phosphorescent light that emanated from sources not marked on any German electrical diagram, revealing additional details and routes that appeared only when viewed from specific angles or during particular atmospheric conditions. We found Hayes at dawn, standing motionless beside the perimeter marker where Rodriguez had left him the previous evening. His rifle lay at his feet, ammunition scattered in patterns that matched the geometric arrangements we'd been discovering throughout the German defensive network. But Hayes himself had changed. Southern features set in expressions of attention that belonged on someone else's face, eyes tracking movements in the forest that none of us could detect. "Well, I'll be damned," he said when he saw us approach, but his voice carried different inflections, subtle changes in accent and cadence that made the familiar phrase sound foreign and wrong. "Y'all took your time getting back. Been having the most interesting conversations while you were gone. Learning all sorts of things about this sector that ain't in any intelligence reports." Rodriguez approached cautiously, rifle ready but pointed away from our fellow Marine. "Hayes, you okay? You were pretty shaken up yesterday talking about voices and seeing things that weren't there." But as he spoke, I could see his growing unease at changes in Hayes that went beyond simple shell shock or battlefield stress. Something fundamental had altered in our squad mate during the night we'd spent in the command post. Hayes smiled with expressions that didn't match his usual personality. Southern charm replaced by something calculating and alien. "Oh, I'm fine, Rodriguez. Better than fine, actually. See, I've been talking to some German fellas who've been real helpful about explaining what's been happening in this sector. Turns out they ain't the enemy anymore. They're part of something bigger, something that's been going on long before this war started." Chen documented Hayes' condition with scientific detachment, noting physical changes that accompanied the personality alterations. "Pupils dilated but responsive to light," he observed, sketching notes while maintaining careful distance from our transformed squadmate. "Speech patterns altered, vocabulary expanded, knowledge of information he shouldn't possess. But no signs of physical trauma or coercion. Whatever happened to him seems to have been voluntary." The whistling pattern began as Hayes continued talking. 3-note melody now emanating from his throat in harmonies that shouldn't have been possible from a single human voice. But Hayes didn't seem aware he was producing the sounds, continuing his conversation about German advisors who had provided him with tactical information and strategic guidance that rendered our original mission obsolete. "This ain't right," Kowalski muttered, studying Hayes with the careful attention he'd learned to apply to anything that defied normal explanation. "Hayes, You're talking about tactical situations and unit movements that don't match any intelligence we've received. Where are you getting this information, and who exactly have you been talking to?" Hayes laughed with genuine amusement, but the sound carried harmonic structures that made our teeth ache and our vision blur slightly around the edges. "Oh, Kowalski, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. But I've been learning about the real war, the one that's been going on underneath all this surface fighting between Americans and Germans. Turns out both sides been getting help from folks who understand warfare better than any general or admiral." Rodriguez blessed himself repeatedly as Hayes continued his exposition, Spanish prayers flowing faster as our squad mate described underground tactical conferences between German officers and advisors who provided military guidance in exchange for access to surface positions and personnel. The transformation wasn't just psychological. Hayes moved with different posture, gestured with unfamiliar hand positions, demonstrated knowledge of German language and military doctrine that he'd never studied. "Hayes, we need to get you back to medical," I decided, though standard evacuation procedures seemed inadequate for conditions that didn't exist in any military manual. "You've been through something that requires evaluation by personnel with training we don't have. Can you walk, or do we need to arrange transport?" But Hayes shook his head with patient condescension, southern features arranged in expressions of superior knowledge that belonged on someone decades older and infinitely more experienced in matters that transcended conventional warfare. "Sarge, I appreciate your concern, but I ain't going nowhere. Got responsibilities now, duties that go beyond following orders from officers who don't understand what's really happening in this sector." The whistling grew louder as Hayes spoke, three-note pattern now accompanied by sounds that seemed to come from the German defensive positions we'd been investigating. But the melody had changed, becoming more complex and purposeful, as if Hayes had become a component in some vast communication system that connected surface positions to underground networks we'd only begun to explore. "He's not Hayes anymore," Rodriguez whispered, recognition and horror competing in his voice. "Whatever we've been tracking through this sector, it's found a way inside. He looks like Hayes, sounds like Hayes, but he's something else now. Something that's been watching us, learning from us, preparing to use what it's learned." We left Hayes at the perimeter marker, unable to force evacuation, and unwilling to engage in combat with someone who had been our squad mate just hours earlier. But as we moved toward the underground tunnel system, Hayes's laughter followed us through the forest, harmonizing with that omnipresent whistling in ways that suggested our reconnaissance mission had become something far more dangerous than investigating abandoned German positions. The tunnel entrance gaped before us like a wound in the earth, concrete giving way to natural stone that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Rodriguez led our descent, his New Mexico hunting experience translating to underground navigation better than any military training we'd received. But these weren't normal caves. The air tasted metallic and wrong, carrying flavors that made our saliva thick and our thoughts sluggish, as if the atmosphere itself had been processed through something that understood breathing but not biology. My shrapnel wound opened completely as we descended, old fragments working their way through muscle and skin under atmospheric pressure that seemed to increase with every step deeper into the earth. Blood soaked through my field dressing, but the wound felt cold rather than painful. Metal fragments responding to some magnetic property in the tunnel air that drew them toward the surface of my skin with gentle insistence. "Dios mío, the walls are breathing," Rodriguez whispered, his voice carrying clearly in air, so still it seemed to amplify every sound while muffling others according to logic I couldn't understand. The stone surfaces around us did seem to expand and contract in slow rhythms that matched the breathing we'd first heard at the bunker entrance. But now we were inside the lungs, moving through passages that served as airways for some vast underground organism. Chen documented our descent with mechanical precision, though his flashlight batteries drained at rates that defied electrical principles, forcing us to ration illumination in ways that made navigation increasingly treacherous. Temperature differential suggests large open chambers ahead, he observed, consulting instruments that registered readings outside their designed parameters. But the air movement patterns don't match natural cave ventilation. Something's controlling atmospheric circulation down here. Kowalski tested each step carefully, Chicago street instincts warning him about surfaces that looked solid but felt somehow unstable underfoot. "This ain't right," he muttered, studying stone formations that seemed to shift position when viewed peripherally. Tunnel architecture that rearranged itself according to principles that had nothing to do with geology or engineering. These passages ain't natural, but they ain't human construction either. Something carved these tunnels, but something that thinks different than people. The whistling pattern followed us into the depths, three-note melody echoing from tunnel walls in harmonies that suggested multiple sources scattered throughout the underground network. But now, the sound seemed to come from the stone itself, as if the tunnel system had become a vast musical instrument designed to produce specific acoustic effects that influenced the psychology and physiology of anyone passing through its passages. Our limited flashlight beams revealed carved symbols similar to the wooden markers that had guided us this far. But these markings had been burned directly into stone with techniques that left the rock surface smooth and reflective. Mirror-bright patches that caught our electric light and threw it back in directions that created optical illusions and shadow patterns that hurt to look at directly. Someone's been modifying these caves for a long time, I realized, studying carving techniques that showed different levels of skill and different approaches to stonework, as if multiple generations of craftsmen had worked to transform natural caves into something that served purposes beyond simple shelter or storage. This isn't recent German construction. Some of these modifications look like they predate the war by decades, maybe centuries. Rodriguez prayed continuously now, Spanish supplications echoing from tunnel walls that seemed to absorb his words and process them into sounds that returned as responses in languages that predated human speech. The religious imagery carved into stone surfaces resembled Catholic iconography, but with details that made his prayers come faster and more desperately, as if familiar symbols had been corrupted into forms that challenged rather than comforted faith. As we descended deeper, the tunnel branched into multiple passages, each route marked with symbols that corresponded to our individual squad members, but altered in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of our psychology, our fears, our individual weaknesses and strengths. The unknown architects had prepared personalized routes, pathways designed specifically for each of us based on observation and analysis that had begun long before we'd entered this sector. "We stay together," I ordered, though the tunnel architecture seemed designed to separate us, passages narrowing and widening in ways that made group movement difficult, while encouraging individual exploration of routes that promised answers to personal questions we hadn't realized we were asking. Whatever's down here wants us divided, isolated, easier to manage individually. But as we pressed deeper into the underground network, the breathing walls seemed to pulse with increasing urgency, and the whistling patterns became more complex and insistent. Musical structures that suggested we were approaching something that had been waiting for our arrival, preparing for our visit, anticipating our descent into spaces where different rules applied, and different forms of intelligence held authority over life, death, and everything that existed in the spaces between those familiar concepts. The chamber opened before us like a cathedral carved from living stone, domed ceiling, disappearing into darkness beyond our flashlight range. But it was the arrangement on the chamber floor that stopped us in stunned recognition. Thousands of pieces of German military equipment laid out in spiral patterns that radiated from a central point where something waited in shadows too thick for our electric beams to penetrate. Every item we'd encountered during our investigation was represented here, multiplied and organized according to mathematical principles that demonstrated intelligence far beyond human military doctrine. Helmets formed the outer ring. Hundreds of Stahlhelms arranged in the same pattern we'd discovered at the machine gun position, but now the circle extended across the entire chamber floor, each helmet positioned with precision that suggested surveying instruments and extended planning. Within the helmet circle, rifles stood in formation. Muzzles pointed toward the chamber center, while ammunition belts created smaller spirals that connected individual weapons in patterns that resembled electrical circuits or neural networks. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez breathed, the English blasphemy carrying more weight than his usual Spanish prayers. It's everything we've seen topside, but more. Much more. Like someone's been collecting German equipment for months, maybe years, arranging it in patterns. He stopped speaking as the implications became clear. The spiral arrangement wasn't random artistic expression. It was functional, purposeful, designed to focus energy or attention toward whatever waited in the chamber's dark center. Chen approached the equipment spiral with scientific fascination, overcoming survival instincts, studying the mathematical relationships between different categories of military gear. Geometric progression in the spiral formation, he observed, sketching patterns that hurt to look at directly. Each ring follows specific proportional relationships, distances calculated to create resonance effects between metallic objects. This is engineering, but according to principles that don't exist in any manual I've studied. The personal items that had been rearranged in our sleeping areas were represented here as well, but multiplied and enhanced, as if our individual possessions had been used as templates for creating larger collections of similar objects. Kowalski's lucky charm appeared dozens of times throughout the spiral, while Rodriguez's rosary beads formed connecting patterns between different equipment categories. Someone had been studying us through our possessions, learning our psychological patterns and incorporating that knowledge into the chamber's design. Kowalski moved among the arranged equipment with growing unease, recognizing items that should have been unique but appeared here in multiple copies, personal effects that had been replicated with attention to details that suggested intimate knowledge of their original owners. "This ain't right," he whispered, studying his own gear scattered throughout the spiral in quantities that defied explanation. "These are my things, but too many of them. Like someone's been making copies, studying them, figuring out what makes them important to me." The whistling pattern filled the chamber as we explored the equipment arrangement. Three-note melody now coming from the metal objects themselves, vibrations passing through steel and iron to create harmonic structures that seemed to focus acoustic energy toward the chamber center. The sound was beautiful and terrible, familiar melodies processed through materials that understood music but not humanity, creating effects that made our vision blur and our balance uncertain. My shrapnel wound responded to the metallic resonance, old fragments heating under my skin until they felt like they might work their way out entirely. The chamber's acoustic properties seemed designed to affect metal objects, whether they were arranged in the spiral pattern or embedded in human flesh, creating physical responses that went beyond mere sound to influence the behavior of iron and steel in ways that challenged physics and medical understanding. "Look at the center," Rodriguez whispered, pointing toward the focal point of the equipment spiral where shadows seemed to move independently of our flashlight beams. Something's there, something that all this gear is pointed toward. All these weapons, all this equipment, it's not random decoration. It's all aimed at whatever's sitting in the middle of this arrangement. As we studied the spiral pattern, I realized the chamber represented not just collection and organization, but preparation. Someone had been gathering German military equipment and arranging it according to principles that transformed individual weapons and tools into components of some larger system. A vast machine or mechanism that used familiar objects for purposes that transcended their original military functions. The equipment spiral stretched beyond the range of our illumination, patterns continuing into darkness that suggested the chamber was far larger than we'd initially realized. We were looking at the visible portion of an arrangement that might extend for hundreds of yards. Thousands of pieces of military gear organized according to mathematical principles that demonstrated planning, intelligence, and purpose that operated on scales beyond human comprehension. We're not the first squad to investigate this sector, I realized, studying equipment arrangements that included American gear mixed with German material, personal effects, and military hardware that suggested other reconnaissance missions had contributed to the chamber's growing collection. Other teams have been here, left their equipment, maybe left more than equipment. This whole arrangement, we're looking at the accumulated gear of everyone who's tried to investigate what happened to the German regiment. The tunnel walls had developed a rhythm that matched human respiration. Stone surfaces expanding and contracting in patterns that created the illusion we were traveling through the digestive system of some vast underground organism. But this was an illusion. The walls were actually moving, limestone and concrete flexing in ways that defied geological principles while maintaining structural integrity that kept the tunnels from collapsing despite their organic behavior. Rodriguez pressed his hand against the pulsing stone, feeling the rhythm that seemed to respond to his touch by synchronizing with his own heartbeat. "Dios mío, it's alive," he whispered, Spanish accent thick with wonder and growing terror. "The whole tunnel system, it's breathing, it's responding to us, it knows we're here." The walls seemed to pulse faster when he spoke, as if his voice provided stimulation that encouraged increased metabolic activity. Chen documented the phenomenon with scientific detachment, though his measurements defied rational explanation. Stone surfaces are maintaining flexibility while supporting structural loads that should require rigid materials, he observed, consulting instruments that registered readings outside their designed parameters. Temperature fluctuations suggest active circulation systems, but there's no evidence of the biological infrastructure that would be necessary to support organic functions of this scale. The breathing walls created acoustic effects that made navigation increasingly difficult, sounds echoing in patterns that suggested the tunnel system was actively listening to our conversations and movements. Our voices seemed to travel through stone passages that processed human speech and returned modified versions. Words altered in subtle ways that made communication uncertain and potentially dangerous if the wrong phrase triggered unwanted responses. Kowalski tested the wall surfaces with his knife, finding stone that yielded to pressure like living tissue, but maintained the hardness and durability of rock when struck directly. "This ain't right," he muttered, studying blade marks that seemed to heal themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. "These walls are acting like they're alive, but they're still stone, still concrete. Something's making dead materials behave like living tissue." My shrapnel wound throbbed in rhythm with the wall pulsations, old metal fragments seeming to respond to whatever force animated the tunnel system. The breathing walls created atmospheric pressure changes that made the fragments shift under my skin, working their way toward the surface with movements that matched the geological respiration surrounding us. I was becoming part of the tunnel system, my body synchronizing with its alien physiology. The whistling pattern seemed to emanate from the walls themselves now. 3-note melody produced by air moving through stone passages that functioned as wind instruments, creating music that grew more complex as we moved deeper into the underground network. But the melodies were interactive, responding to our movements and conversations with musical phrases that suggested the tunnel system was attempting to communicate through acoustic means. The whole network is one organism, I realized, studying wall formations that connected different tunnel branches in ways that resembled circulatory systems or neural networks. We're not moving through separate passages. We're inside something alive, something that's been growing and developing underground for who knows how long. The German positions, the equipment arrangements, the personnel disappearances, they're all part of feeding this thing, helping it grow. Rodriguez tried to maintain military discipline despite growing evidence that conventional tactics had no application in spaces that operated according to biological rather than geological principles. Sarge, if these walls are alive, if the whole tunnel system is some kind of organism, then we're not conducting reconnaissance anymore. We're inside something that's digesting us, learning from us, maybe preparing to use us for purposes we can't understand. As we continued deeper into the breathing tunnels, our squad became separated despite efforts to maintain formation. The walls seemed to pulse in ways that created optical illusions, passages that appeared to continue straight ahead but actually curved in directions that left us moving through different branches of the tunnel network without realizing we'd been divided. The breathing walls had developed tactics for isolating intruders, separating potential threats to make them easier to manage individually. "Jen? Rodriguez?" I called, but the breathing walls absorbed my voice and returned echoes that sounded like responses from my missing squad mates, conversations that seemed to come from directions that led deeper into the tunnel system. The walls were learning to imitate human voices, using our own words to lure us toward destinations that served the organism's purposes rather than our mission objectives. The tunnel system had become a predator that used familiar sounds and apparent safety to guide prey toward central processing areas where whatever intelligence controlled the breathing walls could examine, evaluate, and incorporate new arrivals into its growing understanding of surface world military doctrine and human psychology. We were no longer Marines conducting reconnaissance. We were specimens being prepared for integration into something that existed beyond the boundaries of the war we thought we were fighting. The wall stretched before me like a museum display dedicated to human memory. Thousands of personal items arranged in systematic patterns that documented the lives and deaths of soldiers from multiple armies and multiple conflicts. Dog tags hung in chronological order, unit insignia organized by nationality and service branch, while personal photographs created a mosaic of faces that stared out from the stone surface with expressions frozen in moments of happiness that preceded their owner's disappearance into this underground collection. Chen sat motionless before the display, his California pragmatism overwhelmed by the scope of what we were witnessing. His field notebook lay open beside him, pages filled with sketches and measurements that had grown increasingly erratic as he'd attempted to document arrangements that defied systematic analysis. "It goes back decades," he whispered, voice carrying the strain of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged. "Maybe centuries, equipment and personal effects from wars I've never heard of, conflicts that predate any military history I know. The items had been preserved with care that suggested reverence rather than mere collection. Each piece cleaned and maintained according to standards that exceeded military regulation. Letters remained legible despite their age. Photographs showed no signs of deterioration, while metal objects gleamed with polish that made them appear newly manufactured rather than recovered from battlefields across multiple continents and time periods. Rodriguez appeared in my peripheral vision, standing before a section of the display that featured Catholic religious items, crucifixes, prayer books, rosary beads arranged in patterns that resembled church altars, but with subtle modifications that made his Spanish prayers come faster and more desperately. "Dios mío, these are holy things," he breathed, "but they've been changed, altered in ways that make them serve different purposes. Someone's been studying religious faith, learning how to use sacred objects for purposes that have nothing to do with salvation." The whistling pattern that had followed us throughout our mission now seemed to emanate from the personal effects themselves. Three-note melody produced by air moving through arranged objects in ways that created harmonic structures that told stories. Individual items combining to produce musical narratives that described the lives, fears, and final moments of their original owners. The wall had become a vast musical instrument that played the accumulated experiences of everyone who had contributed to its collection. Kowalski's voice echoed from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system, Chicago accent carrying clearly through stone passages that seemed designed to amplify and redirect sound according to principles that had nothing to do with natural acoustics. "This ain't right, Sarge," he called, but his words seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, as if the tunnel system was learning to reproduce his voice and use it for purposes that had nothing to do with communication between squad members. My own personal effects appeared throughout the display, items I remembered losing during previous deployments, but also things I'd never seen before that somehow belonged to me. Photographs of family members I didn't recognize, letters written in my handwriting describing events I'd never experienced, medals awarded for actions I'd never performed. The collection included not just what I had been, but what I might have been under different circumstances. It's learning from us, I realized, studying arrangements that demonstrated intimate knowledge of each squad member's psychology, personal history, and individual fears. Every person who's entered this tunnel system has contributed to this collection, but it's not just taking our possessions, it's taking our memories, our experiences, our individual identity, and incorporating them into something larger. The personal effects seemed to pulse with their own light, phosphorescence that made viewing the display possible despite our failing flashlight batteries. But the illumination revealed details that hurt to examine directly. Items that moved slightly when viewed peripherally, photographs whose subjects seemed to shift expression based on viewing angle, letters whose text rearranged itself when read too carefully. Chen remained motionless before the display, and as I approached him I realized his stillness wasn't voluntary. Something had frozen him in place, leaving him conscious and aware, but unable to move, positioned to observe the personal effects gallery with the fixed attention of someone undergoing forced education about the scope and purpose of the collection he was now destined to join. "Chen?" I called, but he couldn't respond, though his eyes tracked my movement with expressions that suggested he understood what was happening to him and wanted to warn me about dangers I was already beginning to experience. The tunnel system had developed methods for immobilizing visitors while they were processed, evaluated, and prepared for integration into the growing collection of personal effects that documented everyone who had attempted to investigate what lay beneath the surface war. The whistling pattern grew more complex as I stood before the personal effects gallery. Three-note melody now accompanied by harmonies that seemed to call names. Individual musical phrases that corresponded to specific items in the collection. The wall was trying to communicate, using personal effects as vocabulary to describe the experiences and fate of everyone who had contributed to its growing understanding of human nature, military doctrine, and the individual psychology that made each soldier a unique addition to its permanent display. As I backed away from Chen's motionless form, the personal effects seemed to track my movement with attention that suggested they retained some connection to their original owners, items that had become windows through which the tunnel system could observe and influence the surface world through accumulated human experience and memory. The central chamber opened before me like a cathedral designed by intelligence that understood architecture but not humanity. Curved walls rising into darkness that swallowed my failing flashlight beam, while creating acoustic effects that made every sound seem to come from multiple directions simultaneously. But it was the absence at the chamber's center that demanded attention. Not a creature or entity, but a space where reality seemed to fold in on itself, creating gravitational effects that made looking directly at it painful and disorienting. Rodriguez stood at the chamber's edge in perfect military attention, rifle at port arms, eyes fixed on the central absence with expressions that belonged on his face but carried implications that challenged everything I knew about my squadmate. He didn't respond when I called his name, didn't acknowledge my presence, but maintained his position with the mechanical precision of someone following orders from authority that transcended human military hierarchy. "Rodriguez," I tried again, approaching cautiously while keeping my rifle ready, and my attention divided between my motionless squadmate and the central absence that seemed to pulse with energy that made my shrapnel wound burn with increasing intensity. The old metal fragments under my skin responded to whatever occupied the chamber center, heating and shifting as if drawn toward something that exerted magnetic influence over iron and steel. Kowalski appeared from another tunnel entrance, moving with the same mechanical precision that characterized Rodriguez's behavior, taking position on the opposite side of the chamber where he stood at attention with expressions that suggested his consciousness remained intact but under control of something that understood military discipline better than any human commander. His Chicago skepticism had been replaced by acceptance of authority that originated from the chamber's central absence. The whistling pattern filled the chamber with harmonies that seemed to emanate from the stone walls themselves. Three-note melody, now accompanied by complex musical structures that created physical effects, vision distortion, balance problems, mental processes that became sluggish and uncertain. But the music was beautiful. Achingly familiar melodies that seemed to call from childhood memories I couldn't quite identify. Songs that felt like home and safety and belonging to something larger than individual consciousness. My remaining ammunition felt impossibly heavy. Magazines that had been manageable throughout our mission, now requiring effort to carry as whatever occupied the chamber center exerted influence over metallic objects. But the weight wasn't just physical. Each cartridge seemed to carry the accumulated expectations of everyone who had contributed to the chamber's growing collection of military equipment and personal effects, responsibility for actions and decisions that extended far beyond our original reconnaissance mission. This is the source, I realized, studying the central absence that seemed to organize and direct everything we'd encountered during our investigation. Not German, not American, not human. Something that's been using the war as cover for its own activities, learning about surface military doctrine and human psychology by studying the soldiers and equipment that get funneled into this underground network. The absence pulsed with energy that made direct observation impossible, but peripheral vision revealed suggestions of vast complexity. Organizational structures that extended far beyond the chamber, connections to tunnel networks that spanned continents, influences that reached into surface conflicts across multiple theaters of war. We had stumbled into something that existed on scales beyond human comprehension, using local military activity as components in much larger operations. Rodriguez and Kowalski maintained their positions with mechanical precision, but their eyes tracked my movements with expressions that suggested they remained aware of what was happening while being unable to resist whatever control the central absence exerted over their behavior. They were still my squad mates, but they were also something else now. Components in a vast organizational system that used human consciousness for purposes that transcended individual identity. The chamber walls displayed carved symbols that hurted to look at directly. Mathematical formulas and geometric patterns that seemed to describe relationships between concepts that had no names in human language. But studying the carvings created understanding that bypassed rational thought. Direct knowledge about the scope and purpose of operations that used surface wars as cover for activities that spanned geological time and interplanetary space. My final magazine slipped from my hands, metal cartridges scattering across a stone floor that absorbed them into patterns that connected to the chamber's larger organizational systems. The ammunition didn't disappear. It was incorporated, becoming part of arrangements that transformed individual bullets into components of something that could influence events across multiple battlefields simultaneously. The whistling pattern reached crescendo as I stood alone in the chamber center, three-note melody now coming from directions that existed outside normal three-dimensional space. Harmonies that seemed to originate from past and future simultaneously. The sound was no longer just communication, it was invitation, offering membership in organizational structures that existed beyond the limitations of individual human consciousness and temporary surface conflicts. As the central absence drew me toward integration with systems that operated on scales beyond human comprehension, I understood that our reconnaissance mission had been successful in ways no military commander had anticipated. We had discovered what happened to the German regiment, but we had also become part of it, components and operations that used surface wars as training exercises for activities that extended far beyond the terrestrial conflicts that had brought us to this underground chamber, where different rules applied and different forms of intelligence held authority over life, death, and everything that existed in the spaces between those familiar concepts. The climb toward surface began as desperation, became survival, transformed into something approaching religious experience, as I clawed my way through tunnel passages that seemed to actively resist my escape from spaces that wanted to keep me, for purposes I was only beginning to understand. My remaining gear had been abandoned in the apex chamber, rifle and ammunition left behind with Rodriguez and Kowalski, who maintained their positions with mechanical precision that suggested they had found their permanent assignment in operations that transcended surface military objectives. The breathing walls compressed around me as I climbed, stone surfaces that had seemed organic and welcoming during our descent, now revealing themselves as muscular structures designed to prevent departure from underground spaces that functioned as processing areas for surface military personnel. But something in my wounded condition made me unsuitable for integration. My shrapnel fragments, creating interference with whatever systems the tunnel network used to control human consciousness and behavior. Behind me, voices that sounded like Rodriguez and Kowalski called my name with increasing urgency. Spanish and English words that carried familiar inflections, but described tactical situations that bore no relationship to our original mission or current circumstances. The tunnel system had learned to reproduce their voices, but couldn't quite master the content, creating conversations that revealed the artificial nature of communication from squadmates who were no longer entirely human. "Sarge, wait up!" Kowalski's voice echoed from passages that led deeper into the tunnel system. Chicago accent perfect, except for subtle harmonic undertones that made the words carry implications about underground tactical objectives and surface military activities that served purposes beyond American or German strategic goals. Got new orders from command. Real interesting stuff about extended operations in sectors that don't appear on any map. Rodriguez's voice joined the artificial conversation. Spanish prayers mixed with English military terminology in ways that suggested both languages were being used as tools for psychological manipulation rather than genuine communication. "Dios mío, Sarge, you need to come back. The advisors want to discuss opportunities for career advancement, positions that offer responsibility for operations across multiple theaters of conflict, assignments that last longer than any individual war." The whistling pattern followed me up the tunnel passages, three-note melody now distorted by acoustic effects that suggested the sound was being produced by artificial means, mechanical reproduction of music that had once carried genuine beauty but was being used for purposes that had nothing to do with artistic expression. The tunnel system was trying to lure me back, using every psychological tool it had learned from studying human soldiers and their individual responses to authority, companionship, and musical stimulation. My shrapnel wound bled freely during the climb, old metal fragments working their way through muscle and skin as I moved through spaces that exerted magnetic influence over iron and steel. But the bleeding seemed to provide some protection against the psychological control systems that had claimed Rodriguez and Kowalski, my damaged condition creating interference that prevented full integration with organizational structures that required intact human consciousness. The tunnel passages seemed to shift configuration as I climbed, creating optical illusions that made navigation increasingly difficult, while offering routes that appeared to lead toward surface but actually curved back toward the apex chamber, and the central absence that organized and directed underground activities. But my bleeding wound left a trail that helped me distinguish between genuine escape routes and deceptive passages designed to recapture personnel attempting unauthorized departure from classified operations. "Sergeant Murphy," called a voice that sounded like my commanding officer from previous deployments, authority figures who had died months ago but whose vocal patterns had been preserved and reproduced with perfect accuracy, except for subtle modifications that revealed the artificial nature of communication from sources that had learned human speech without understanding human motivation. "Report to command for debriefing on reconnaissance activities and discussion of permanent assignment to special operations that require extended underground deployment." The breathing walls made final attempts to prevent my escape, stone surfaces contracting to create passages too narrow for human transit while generating atmospheric pressure that made breathing difficult and movement uncertain. But my shrapnel fragments seemed to interfere with the tunnel system's control mechanisms, metal objects that belonged to my body, but operated according to principles that predated whatever intelligence had modified the underground spaces for purposes that transcended geological or military functions. As I reached passages that showed signs of natural cave formation rather than artificial modification, the voices from behind grew more desperate and distorted, familiar inflections breaking down into harmonic patterns that revealed the mechanical nature of communication, from sources that had studied human speech but couldn't quite reproduce the psychological authenticity that made words carry genuine meaning between individuals who shared common experience and mutual trust. The whistling pattern made final attempts to call me back. Three-note melody, now accompanied by harmonies that included every voice I'd ever trusted, every song I'd ever loved, every sound that had ever provided comfort or guidance during difficult circumstances. But the music was too perfect, too precisely calibrated to my individual psychology, revealing itself as artificial reproduction rather than genuine human expression. When I finally reached natural tunnel passages that led toward surface, the artificial voices faded to silence. Mechanical breathing stopped, and the whistling pattern dissolved into echoes that suggested I had moved beyond the range of whatever systems controlled the modified underground spaces, where Rodriguez and Kowalski would continue their new assignments until the surface war ended, and different conflicts required their specialized knowledge of operations that existed in spaces between official military doctrine and activities that served purposes beyond human strategic objectives. They found me 3 days later, collapsed against a shattered oak tree at the edge of Belleau Wood, hypothermic and delirious, mumbling reports about underground chambers and missing squad members in languages that shifted between English, German, and something older that made the medics step back and call for officers with security clearances high enough to handle information that might compromise ongoing intelligence operations. My shrapnel wound had reopened completely, old fragments finally working their way to the surface of my skin, where they lay in patterns that resembled the carved symbols we'd discovered throughout the tunnel system. The search patrol that retrieved me consisted of Marines from units I didn't recognize, soldiers whose unit patches and insignia seemed familiar, but carried subtle modifications that suggested they belonged to organizations that operated outside normal military hierarchy. They handled my evacuation with efficiency that seemed more practiced than the situation warranted, as if recovering personnel from underground reconnaissance missions was a routine operation that occurred frequently enough to require specialized protocols. "Where's the rest of your squad, Sergeant?" asked the lieutenant who supervised my extraction, voice carrying professional concern that didn't quite mask the underlying satisfaction of someone whose predictions had been confirmed by events. "Intelligence reports suggested you might encounter unusual circumstances during your reconnaissance. Did you complete your mission objectives, and can you account for the whereabouts of the Marines under your command?" But when I tried to explain about the tunnel system, the breathing walls, the apex chamber, and whatever had claimed Rodriguez and Kowalski, my words came out in fragments that made no sense even to me. The underground experience had damaged more than my body. Something about the space beneath Belleau Wood had altered my ability to communicate surface experiences using conventional language, leaving me with memories that existed but couldn't be shared through normal means of human expression. The medics treated my wound with techniques that seemed more advanced than standard field medical procedures, instruments and methods that suggested they had experience dealing with injuries caused by exposure to environments that operated according to non-standard physical principles. They removed the shrapnel fragments with precision that indicated familiarity with metal objects that had been modified by electromagnetic fields or other forces not covered in conventional medical training. Severe dehydration, exposure, psychological trauma consistent with extended isolation in hostile environments, reported the corpsman who examined me, voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone documenting conditions he'd encountered before. Physical injuries suggest contact with electrical or magnetic fields of unusual intensity. Recommend immediate transfer to specialized medical facilities equipped for treating personnel who've been exposed to classified operational environments. During the evacuation, I caught glimpses of activity around the German defensive positions we'd been investigating. Work parties and equipment that suggested our reconnaissance mission had been preliminary to larger operations. But the activity seemed wrong somehow. Soldiers working with mechanical precision that reminded me of Rodriguez and Kowalski during their final moments in the apex chamber. Human personnel following orders that served purposes beyond American strategic objectives. The whistling pattern followed me during the evacuation. 3-note melody now faint and distant, but clearly audible during moments of silence when the medical transport paused for navigation or communication with unknown command authorities. The sound had become part of my auditory environment. Background music that suggested my exposure to the underground system had created permanent modifications to my sensory perception and psychological conditioning. "Can you hear that whistling?" I asked the medic who monitored my condition during transport, but his response indicated the sound existed only for personnel who had been exposed to specific environmental conditions that required debriefing by specialists with clearances higher than standard medical personnel were authorized to possess. As we moved away from Belleau Wood, I could see smoke rising from areas that corresponded to the tunnel entrances we'd discovered. Controlled demolitions that suggested someone had decided to seal the underground access points after completing whatever operations our reconnaissance mission had been designed to facilitate. But sealing entrances wouldn't eliminate whatever existed beneath the surface. It would only redirect its activities toward access points that remained unknown to surface military authorities. The medical transport carried me away from the sector where I'd lost my squad, but part of me remained in those underground spaces, consciousness divided between surface military reality and whatever organizational systems operated in the spaces beneath conventional human conflicts. I was a survivor, but I was also a messenger, carrying information about operations that existed outside the boundaries of the war everyone else thought we were fighting. The whistling pattern grew fainter as distance increased, but it never disappeared entirely, becoming permanent background music that suggested my mission was complete, but my service to whatever intelligence controlled the underground network would continue for as long as I remained available for purposes that transcended individual human understanding or voluntary participation in activities that spanned geological time and interplanetary space. The intelligence officers who questioned me operated from offices that didn't appear on any organizational chart I'd ever seen. Personnel whose ranks and unit designations seemed to shift depending on which documents they consulted during our sessions. They approached my testimony with the systematic attention of investigators who had heard similar reports before, taking notes in shorthand that suggested they were familiar with the terminology and concepts I struggled to explain using conventional military language. Sergeant Murphy, your report describes a contact with what you characterize as non-human intelligence, operating underground facilities in the Belleau Wood sector, stated the colonel, whose name changed between our first and second interview, though his face and voice remained consistent despite alterations to his personnel file that suggested he worked for organizations that required flexible identity parameters. Can you provide more specific information about the nature and capabilities of this intelligence, particularly as it relates to ongoing operations in sectors where similar phenomena have been reported? But my attempts to describe the apex chamber, the breathing walls, and the organizational systems that had claimed Rodriguez and Kowalski resulted in testimony that became increasingly fragmentary and contradictory. Words that carried meaning when I spoke them, but transformed into gibberish when transcribed by stenographers who seemed to expect linguistic difficulties from personnel returning from underground reconnaissance missions. Something about my exposure to the tunnel system had created permanent interference with my ability to communicate classified information through normal channels. Official records indicate your squad was lost to German booby traps during routine reconnaissance of abandoned defensive positions, explained the major, whose security clearance allowed him to discuss information that officially didn't exist. Your individual survival was fortuitous but doesn't alter the tactical assessment that the Belleau Wood sector has been cleared of enemy personnel and is available for use in future offensive operations. The debriefing sessions occurred in facilities that seemed to move locations between appointments, offices that were accessible through different building entrances, and contained furniture and equipment that didn't match from one meeting to the next. But the personnel remained constant. Intelligence officers who demonstrated familiarity with operational details that suggested they supervised activities in multiple underground locations, where similar phenomena occurred with sufficient frequency to require specialized investigation protocols. The whistling pattern you describe has been reported by other personnel returning from reconnaissance missions in various theaters, noted the civilian consultant whose presence at military debriefings violated regulations that seemed to be waived for operations that fell outside normal command authority. Can you reproduce the melody or provide additional details about its acoustic properties and psychological effects on military personnel exposed to prolonged auditory stimulation? During questioning, that haunting three-note pattern would sometimes emerge from ventilation systems or electrical equipment in the debriefing rooms, melody that seemed to comment on my testimony and influence the behavior of intelligence officers who would pause their questions to make notes about information they claimed not to have heard. The whistling had followed me from the underground chambers, but it had also preceded my arrival at debriefing facilities that seemed designed to accommodate personnel who carried acoustic phenomena as permanent aspects of their post-operational condition. Medical examination indicates exposure to electromagnetic fields of unusual intensity, resulting in metallic implantation that may continue to influence your sensory perception and psychological conditioning, reported the doctor, whose credentials suggested expertise in treating conditions that didn't exist in standard medical literature. Recovery prognosis is uncertain, but your condition appears stable within parameters established for personnel returning from similar operational environments. The intelligence officers seemed particularly interested in my reports about Rodriguez and Kowalski, asking detailed questions about their final behavior and apparent integration with organizational systems that operated according to non-human principles. But their questions suggested they expected such outcomes, as if personnel losses during underground reconnaissance were acceptable casualties for operations that served strategic objectives beyond individual human comprehension or voluntary participation. Your squad mates may have been assigned to extended operations that require maintaining position in classified locations, suggested the lieutenant whose knowledge of underground activities seemed to exceed his official rank and stated responsibilities. Communication with personnel on special assignment is restricted for security reasons, but their contributions to ongoing operations are valuable and may continue for extended periods regardless of surface military developments. As the debriefing sessions continued, I began to understand that my testimony was being compared to reports from other survivors of similar missions, personnel who had encountered comparable phenomena in underground locations across multiple theaters of conflict. The intelligence officers were collecting information about a larger pattern of activities that used surface wars as cover for operations that existed outside conventional military doctrine, but served purposes that extended far beyond the territorial and political objectives that motivated official combat operations. The debriefing concluded with my assignment to specialized medical facilities, where my condition could be monitored by personnel with experience treating survivors of classified operations, but the intelligence officers made clear that my service record would reflect routine combat casualties rather than exposure to phenomena that officially didn't exist within the boundaries of conflicts that everyone else believed were being fought between human opponents using conventional military strategies and equipment. The Army psychiatrists approached my case with professional skepticism that masked relief at being able to diagnose conditions they understood rather than investigate phenomena that challenge the boundaries of medical science and military psychology. My reports about underground chambers, breathing walls, and non-human intelligence were systematically reinterpreted as symptoms of combat stress, shell shock, and psychological trauma resulting from exposure to German chemical weapons that produced hallucinations and memory distortions in susceptible personnel. Sergeant Murphy presents classic symptoms of acute stress reaction exacerbated by prolonged isolation and exposure to hostile environmental conditions, wrote Dr. Matthews' evaluation reports that transformed my testimony about organizational systems that transcended human consciousness into clinical observations about dissociative episodes and paranoid ideation. Patients' delusions demonstrate remarkable internal consistency, but are clearly products of psychological defense mechanisms designed to process traumatic experiences that exceeded his cognitive capacity for rational interpretation. The medical facility where they housed me specialized in treating personnel whose combat experiences had produced conditions that required extended observation and rehabilitation. But I began to notice that many of the other patients described encounters similar to mine. Underground spaces that operated according to non-human principles, organizational systems that recruited military personnel for purposes that transcended surface conflicts, whistling patterns that persisted long after exposure to whatever produced them. "They got Rodriguez and Chen," whispered Private Morrison during one of our supervised recreation periods, his 1,000-yard stare carrying recognition that transcended official diagnoses of combat fatigue and neurological damage. "Took them down into spaces that ain't on any map, put them to work for something that's been using this war to learn about human military doctrine and individual psychology. But they made the mistake of letting me see too much before they decided I wasn't suitable for permanent assignment." The whistling pattern that had followed me from Belleau Wood continued to manifest during quiet moments in the medical facility. A 3-note melody that seemed to emanate from heating systems, electrical equipment, and sometimes the patients themselves during periods when their medication levels created conditions that allowed unconscious reproduction of acoustic phenomena they'd encountered during classified operations. But the medical staff interpreted these sounds as auditory hallucinations, requiring increased pharmaceutical intervention rather than evidence of ongoing exposure to influences that transcended normal sensory experience. Patient continues to report auditory phenomena consistent with tinnitus resulting from prolonged exposure to artillery fire and explosive devices, noted Dr. Patterson in treatment records that documented my condition without acknowledging the systematic nature of symptoms shared by multiple patients who had returned from underground reconnaissance missions. Recommend continued observation and gradual reduction of stimulant medications that may be contributing to persistent auditory disturbances and paranoid interpretation of environmental sounds. During group therapy sessions, I encountered other survivors of similar missions. Marines, soldiers, and personnel from Allied forces who described experiences that matched mine with remarkable consistency, despite official records that indicated they had served in different theaters and encountered entirely different operational circumstances. But our shared testimony was systematically dismissed as evidence of suggestion and mutual reinforcement of trauma-induced delusions, rather than corroboration of encounters with phenomena that operated outside the boundaries of conventional warfare. "The important thing to remember," explained Dr. Reynolds during individual counseling sessions, "is that your mind created these experiences as a way of processing trauma that was too severe for normal psychological mechanisms to handle. The underground chambers, the breathing walls, the mysterious intelligence. These are symbols your unconscious mind used to represent the overwhelming nature of combat stress and the loss of your squad mates to enemy action." But the medical staff couldn't explain why my shrapnel wound had healed in patterns that matched the carved symbols we'd discovered in the tunnel system, or why metal detectors continued to register readings that suggested metallic objects embedded in my tissue despite surgical removal of all foreign materials during my initial treatment. Something about my exposure to the underground spaces had created permanent modifications to my physiology that transcended conventional medical understanding. The final medical evaluation recommended my discharge from active duty with full disability compensation for psychological conditions resulting from combat exposure. But the paperwork contained subtle modifications to my service record that eliminated any reference to underground reconnaissance or contact with phenomena that fell outside standard military experience. Officially, I had been wounded during routine patrol activities and suffered psychological trauma following the loss of my squad to German booby traps. A story that explained my condition without challenging institutional assumptions about the nature and scope of the conflict we were fighting. As I prepared to leave military service, The whistling pattern seemed to grow stronger rather than fading. Three-note melody that suggested my discharge from official military duty didn't terminate my connection to organizational systems that operated outside conventional command authority. I was returning to civilian life, but part of me would always remain in those underground spaces where different rules applied, and different forms of intelligence maintained authority over operations that transcended the temporary surface conflicts that everyone else believed represented the full scope of human warfare. 63 years after Belleau Wood, I stood before the black granite wall that honored Marines who had died in that forgotten corner of France, my arthritis-gnarled fingers tracing names that included Rodriguez, Chen, and Kowalski, officially killed in action during reconnaissance operations that had never been fully explained to their families or documented in histories that claimed to tell the complete story of American involvement in the Great War. But I knew they weren't dead, not in any conventional sense, still serving in underground operations that continued long after surface conflicts had been resolved through treaties and political accommodations that addressed only the visible aspects of warfare. The whistling pattern returned as I stood before the memorial. 3 notes, clear and haunting, exactly as I'd first heard them in those German trenches, carried on Washington, D.C. morning air that shouldn't have been capable of reproducing sounds from French battlefields that existed outside normal geographic and temporal boundaries. Other veterans gathered for the memorial service seemed to hear it too, old men whose eyes carried recognition of experiences that transcended official military records and acceptable explanations for what they'd encountered during service in conflicts that had been more complex than history books acknowledged. "You hear it too," observed Harold Wickham, whose service record indicated he'd survived similar reconnaissance missions in the Pacific Theater, though his 1,000-yard stare suggested encounters with phenomena that had nothing to do with Japanese military forces. That whistling. It follows us, doesn't it? Reminds us that some wars never end, some operations continue regardless of political settlements and peace treaties that only address surface activities. My phantom rifle weight had never disappeared. Right shoulder carrying the remembered burden of weapons and equipment I'd abandoned in underground chambers where Rodriguez and Kowalski maintained positions that served purposes beyond American strategic objectives. The weight had become part of my physical condition, muscle memory that responded to sounds and situations that triggered responses developed during operations that officially hadn't occurred in locations that didn't exist on any map. The metallic taste that had characterized air in the breathing tunnels returned whenever I encountered electrical storms or situations that produced electromagnetic fields similar to those we'd experienced in the apex chamber. But the taste wasn't unpleasant anymore. It had become familiar, even comforting, a reminder of spaces where different rules applied and different forms of intelligence maintained authority over activities that spanned geological time and interplanetary distances. During the memorial ceremony, I noticed other attendees whose behavior suggested they carried similar experiences. Veterans whose responses to routine sounds and environmental conditions indicated exposure to phenomena that had created permanent modifications to their sensory perception and psychological conditioning. We were survivors, but we were also messengers, carrying information about operations that existed outside the boundaries of conflicts that everyone else believed had been concluded through conventional military and political processes. "The thing about underground operations," whispered Eleanor Rodriguez, whose father had never returned from reconnaissance missions that bore suspicious similarity to mine, "is that they create connections that transcend individual human lifespan. Personnel assigned to certain activities become part of organizational systems that continue functioning regardless of surface world political developments or changes in military doctrine. As the ceremony concluded and other attendees dispersed, I remained before the memorial wall, studying names that represented personnel who had been officially listed as killed in action, but whose actual fate involved assignment to operations that required extended service in locations that existed outside normal spatial and temporal boundaries. Their families had received death benefits and condolence letters, but the personnel themselves continued working for organizational systems that used surface conflicts as recruitment opportunities and training exercises. The whistling pattern continued as evening approached, three-note melody now accompanied by harmonies that seemed to include voices from personnel I'd encountered during my underground reconnaissance. Squad mates and fellow Marines who had found their permanent assignments in operations that served purposes beyond individual human comprehension. The sound was beautiful and terrible, familiar enough to provide comfort but alien enough to remind me that some aspects of military service transcended voluntary enlistment and official discharge procedures. Walking away from the memorial, I carried the weight of knowledge that would die with me because institutional disbelief had made official testimony impossible and personal communication inadequate for describing experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare, human consciousness, and the organizational systems that used military conflicts as components in activities that operated on scales beyond terrestrial, political, and strategic concerns. But the whistling pattern followed me through Washington traffic and urban noise, three notes that would continue long after my individual consciousness had been integrated with whatever systems had claimed Rodriguez, Kowalski, and countless other personnel whose service records reflected conventional military casualties, but whose actual assignments involved extended operations in spaces where different rules applied, and different forms of intelligence maintained authority over life, death, and everything that existed in the spaces between those familiar concepts that humans use to organize experiences they were never meant to fully understand.